She welded steel pipes into her wood stove. Then it heated twice the shack all winter. The cold that winter did not creep in slowly. It attacked before dawn, hard and sudden, like a warning shot fired across the valley. In northern Montana, just miles from the Canadian border, January of 1891 had already buried homesteads under deep snow and silence. But what happened inside Helen Carver's cabin that season would leave men questioning everything they thought they knew about heat, survival, and pride. Helen stood alone in the gray light of morning, her breath hanging in the air inside her own home. Frost traced thin white lines along the loft railing where her son slept. The cast-iron stove in the center of the room glowed dull red, doing its best, yet failing all the same. 10 feet from it, the air turned sharp and bitter. Up in the loft, the cold settled like an unwanted guest. She had burned through nearly a full cord of wood in just 2 weeks. Her hands were split from chopping. Her shoulders ached from hauling logs. Her sons, Ethan and Caleb, tried to help, but they were only boys. Montana winters did not care about age. Ellen watched the thin stream of smoke slip up through the flue pipe and disappear into the pale sky. Heat was leaving with it, precious warmth drifting away into nothing. That was when the idea began to take shape. Months earlier, a railroad worker had stopped by for directions. He had spoken of locomotives and boilers, of steel tubes running through fireboxes to trap wasted heat. Helen had not said much then, she rarely did. But she had listened. Now she studied her stove like it had wronged her family. The heat stayed close to the iron body. It did not travel, it did not reach the loft, it did not reach the corners. It rose and vanished. She pulled a scrap of wood from the floor and burned the tip of a charcoal stick. Slowly, she sketched what she imagined. Steel pipes. 6 of them. Maybe more. They would stand around the stove, not touching it, but close enough to absorb its heat. The bottoms would remain open to the cold floor air. The tops would angle upward toward the loft. Cold air would enter from below. It would warm as it moved through the pipes. Then it would rise and spread. No extra wood, no moving parts, just captured heat. The next morning she rode into town, snow crunching beneath her horse's hooves. She purchased 18 feet of steel pipe and borrowed a welding torch from a ranch hand named Samuel Ducker. He stared at her for a long moment before handing it over. "You planning to build a cannon?" he asked. "Just trying to stay warm," she replied. For 4 days she worked in the shed behind her cabin. Sparks lit the dim space each time the torch met steel. Her gloves stiffened with frost between welds. Her sons watched from the doorway, unsure whether she was building something clever or something dangerous. By the end of the 4th day, the stove no longer stood alone. A rectangular frame of steel pipes wrapped around it on 3 sides. The pipes climbed upward along the flue pipe, spaced carefully 4 inches away from the firebox. Their lower openings faced the floor, their upper ends angled toward the loft railing. Neighbors noticed. Word spread fast in winter when there was little else to talk about. Some chuckled. Others warned that metal near a 700-degree stove would spell disaster. A widow, welding steel around a firebox, was not something people expected to see. Helen did not argue. She had no interest in winning a debate. She only wanted her sons to sleep through the night without waking to frost on their blankets. When she lit the stove that evening, she waited. The fire crackled as always. The iron glowed as always. For several minutes, nothing seemed different. Then she felt it. A soft movement brushed against her skirt. A rising current of warm air that had not been there before. The pipes darkened slightly as they absorbed heat. Slowly, gently, air began to flow from their upper openings. Ethan climbed halfway up the loft ladder and held his hand near one of the pipe ends. He pulled it back with wide eyes. "Ma, it feels like a forge." Helen allowed herself a small smile. That's the idea. Quote. Outside her cabin, doubt was gathering. Samuel Ducker arrived 2 days later, stepping inside with boots still coated in snow. He stood in front of the steel frame and frowned. "This thing is a fire waiting to happen," he said. "One crack in that pipe and the whole place goes up." "The pipes are open on both ends," Helen answered calmly. "Air keeps them cool enough. There's nothing inside them to burn." Samuel shook his head. He left unconvinced. Soon after, Garrett Finch, a respected metalworker in the valley, came by. He barely glanced at the structure before letting out a short laugh. "You can't fight nature," he said. "Heat rises. If you want warmth upstairs, move the stove or buy a bigger one. Wrapping it in pipes won't change that." Helen listened. She did not argue. She had already tested the flow with her own hands. The third critic arrived the following morning. Douglas Peterman, a traveling heating specialist, stepped inside and surveyed the stove without removing his gloves. "You're creating back pressure on the flue," he warned. "If one of those pipes warps, it could collapse into the firebox." "Come back in January," Helen replied evenly. "Tell me I'm wrong, then." Peterman left certain he had just witnessed the beginning of a disaster. Helen stood alone after he rode away. Doubt pressed against her thoughts like the cold pressed against her walls. But she did not remove a single pipe. She had spent too many winters feeding a stove that never fed her back. She had split too many logs just to keep frost from claiming the loft. She trusted what she felt with her own hands more than the pride of men who had never watched her sons shiver in the dark. January was coming, and it would reveal which of them understood the cold better. For the first week after Helen finished the pipe frame, the valley waited for failure. Snow fell without pause across northern Montana. Wind pressed against cabin walls and slipped through every crack it could find. Families woke before dawn to feed their stoves, then woke again in the middle of the night to do the same. Smoke hung low over the valley like a gray ceiling that refused to lift. Inside Helen Carver's cabin, the fire burned steady. On the third morning after the pipes were installed, she rose before sunrise. The air inside felt cool, but it did not bite. Her breath did not cloud as thick as it once had. She walked to the loft ladder and placed her hand against the railing. No frost. She climbed halfway up. Ethan and Caleb were still asleep under their blankets. Their cheeks were pink, not pale. She touched the wall beside them. It felt dry and only slightly cool. Helen climbed back down and added 2 small logs to the stove. Within minutes, she heard it again. That low, steady hum of air moving through the pipes. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. Warm air drifted from the pipe openings near the loft. It rolled across the ceiling, then slowly sank along the far wall. The corners that once stayed frozen now felt alive with heat. She did not celebrate. She simply worked through her morning the way she always had. Oatmeal on the stove. Boots by the door. Wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Outside, others were not as calm. Samuel Ducker returned on the 5th day, not with criticism this time, but with curiosity. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment he said nothing. The air was warm enough that he removed his hat. "How much wood you burn in now?" he asked. Helen pointed toward her stack near the wall. It was barely touched. 4 logs in the morning, she said. 3 in the afternoon. 2 before bed. Samuel stared at her. "That's half what I'm using." Helen nodded. "Maybe less." He walked slowly around the stove, studying the pipes from every angle. He held his hand near one of the lower openings and felt the cool air being drawn inside. Then he stood beneath the upper outlets and felt the steady warmth pouring out. He did not apologize. He was not that kind of man. But when he left, he looked back once more before stepping into the snow. 2 days later, the temperature dropped hard. On January 21st, the mercury fell to 18 below before sunrise. The wind sharpened overnight, slicing across open fields and rattling cabin shutters. Horses turned their backs to it. Dogs stayed curled tight against barn walls. Smoke thickened above every homestead. Inside the Carver cabin, Helen woke before dawn again. She braced herself for the familiar ache in her teeth that came with deep cold. She expected to see frost on the loft beams. Instead, the air felt steady, cool, but livable. She added kindling and 2 logs. Within minutes, the pipes warmed and began pushing air upward. Ethan climbed down from the loft without shivering. "Ma, it's not bad up there," he said. "Not like last winter." Helen only nodded. She did not trust the cold yet. Montana winters like to trick people into hope before striking harder. By mid-morning, the main room held steady near 68 degrees. The loft hovered just above 60. Outside, the wind howled across open ground. Word began to travel. Martin Holloway, who lived 2 miles east, arrived with frost clinging to his beard. He claimed he needed to borrow an axe. When Helen opened the door, warm air spilled out around him. He stepped inside and stopped. "Good Lord," he muttered. "It's warmer in here than my place in October." He moved straight toward the stove. He touched one of the pipes and jerked his hand back. "That's what Samuel was complaining about," he said. "Feels like a forge." Helen gave a small smile. "Feels like sleeping through the night." "How much wood?" Martin asked. She told him. He went quiet. 15 logs a day," he admitted. "And my loft's still frost white." He left with more questions than he brought. 3 days later, another man arrived. Victor Hale, a quiet farmer known for keeping records of rainfall and crop yields. He carried a small thermometer and a notepad. "Mind if I measure?" he asked. Helen stepped aside. Victor stood in the center of her main room and waited for the thermometer to settle. He wrote down the number carefully. Then he climbed the loft ladder and measured again. He said nothing at first. Outside, it was 12 below. Inside the main room, 67. The loft, 61. Victor closed his notebook slowly. "I've lived here 30 years, he said. Never seen that kind of spread in a single room." He rode straight from her cabin to the Holloway place and took the same measurements. 54 degrees in the main room, 43 in the loft, nearly twice the wood burned. By the end of the week, half the valley had heard. Men who once laughed leaned in closer now. They ran their hands along the steel pipes. They crouched near the lower openings and felt the cold air being pulled inside. They stood beneath the upper ends and let warm air brush their faces. Garrett Finch returned as well. This time he did not laugh. "You didn't trap the heat," he said quietly. "You moved it." Helen looked at him but said nothing. Garrett studied the welds. They were not perfect, but they were strong. The spacing was careful, the design simple. "You ever think about building more of these?" he asked. "I built it to keep my boys warm," she replied. "That's all." Outside, winter tightened its grip. But inside the Carver cabin, the cold had finally met something stronger than pride. It had met a woman who refused to let it win. By the last week of January, the cold stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a test. The sky over northern Montana turned a hard gray that did not change from sunrise to sunset. Snow no longer fell in soft layers. It came in sharp bursts, driven sideways by wind that howled across open fields and rattled cabin doors. Livestock huddled close to fences. Men woke in the dark to feed stoves that never seemed satisfied. Except one. Helen Carver's cabin stood at the edge of the lodgepole pines, smoke rising steady but thin from the chimney. Not thick and desperate like the others. Not constant. Just enough. Inside, the pipe frame did its quiet work. Cold air slid into the lower openings near the floor. It traveled upward through steel warmed by the stove's firebox. By the time it reached the angled tops near the loft, it flowed out as steady heat. The current circled the room, pushing warmth into corners that had once belonged to frost. Helen did not speak much about it. She did not brag. She did not invite people in. They came on their own. One morning, 3 men arrived together. Samuel Ducker, Garrett Finch, Douglas Peterman. They did not come laughing this time. Samuel stepped inside first. He removed his gloves almost immediately. Garrett followed, eyes fixed on the pipes. Peterman lingered near the door, watching the flue pipe closely as if expecting it to shake or groan. The temperature outside was 20 below. Garrett walked straight to the center of the room and stood still. "It's steady," he said quietly. Peterman moved to the flue pipe and held his hand near it. The draft was clean, no smoke spilling back, no strange sounds, no sign of pressure building. "You didn't choke the chimney," he admitted. Helen placed another small log into the stove. She used less wood now. The stack beside her wall proved it. Samuel crouched near one of the lower pipe openings and held a small scrap of cloth close to it. The fabric fluttered inward. "Draw's real," he said. Garrett climbed halfway up the loft ladder and held his palm near the upper pipe ends. He stayed there longer than Ethan ever had. He felt the heat move past his fingers in a steady stream. "How many logs yesterday?" he asked. 8, Helen answered. Garrett looked down at Samuel. "I burned 16. Peterman finally stepped fully inside. He removed his gloves, something he rarely did in another person's home during winter. He circled the stove slowly. "Steel hasn't warped," he muttered. "Welds are holding." Helen met his eyes. "I spaced them 4 inches off the firebox, enough to heat, not enough to glow." Peterman nodded once. He could not argue with numbers, not when he felt the proof on his own skin. Outside, the valley struggled. Wood piles shrank faster than expected. Men rode farther into the forest for cutting. Some families closed off half their cabins to conserve heat. Children slept 2 to a bed to stay warm. Inside Helen's cabin, the loft stayed livable. No frost traced the rafters. No blankets stiffened overnight. By early February, the first copy appeared. A trapper named Eli Morton, who lived north along the frozen creek, built his own version. His welds were rough. His pipes were uneven. But when he lit his stove, warm air began to move the same way. He rode to Helen's place 2 days later. "It works," he said, almost confused. "Not as clean as yours, but it works." Helen showed him how to angle the upper pipes more toward the loft opening. She did not charge him. She did not ask for credit. Then another neighbor followed. Then another. Old wagon frames were cut apart for steel. Abandoned plow blades were reshaped. Scrap metal that once sat ignored became valuable overnight. Garrett Finch returned, this time with tools in his wagon. "I'm building these proper," he said. "Clean welds. Strong pipe, folks are asking." Helen did not object. She only handed him the measurements she had burned into memory. Within 2 weeks, 5 cabins in the valley had pipe frames wrapped around their stoves. Some designs were simple. Some reached higher along the flue. But all followed the same idea. Capture the heat before it escapes. By mid-February, 17 homes within 50 miles had adopted the design. The change was not dramatic. There were no cheers, no grand announcements. There was simply less shivering. Wood stacks lasted longer. Families slept deeper. Smoke above the valley thinned slightly. One evening, Martin Holloway stopped by again. This time, not for tools. "My wife says we finally slept through the night," he told Helen. "First time in 3 winters." Helen stirred stew over the stove as warm air moved quietly around her. "Good," she said. Martin shifted his hat in his hands. "You know folks are talking." Helen glanced up. "They say you beat the cold." She shook her head gently. "No one beats Montana winter." Martin smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but you sure made it blink." That night, as wind pressed against the cabin walls, Helen stood beside her stove and listened. The pipes hummed softly. The loft held steady warmth. Ethan and Caleb slept without turning restlessly under blankets. For the first time since her husband died, Helen felt something other than survival inside those walls. She felt control, not over the weather, not over the valley, but over her own home. And in northern Montana, that was enough to change everything. By late February, the valley no longer whispered about Helen Carver's stove. It studied it. Men who once dismissed her now arrived with measuring tape and notebooks. They crouched near the lower pipe openings and counted inches. They traced weld lines with calloused fingers. They argued over pipe diameter and spacing like miners debating gold veins. Outside, winter still ruled the land. Snowbanks stood taller than fence posts. The wind cut through wool coats and froze breath midair. But inside more cabins now, warmth moved differently. Garrett Finch had begun building proper pipe frames for families who could not weld their own. He charged a fair price and worked long hours in his shop. 11 frames were finished before March arrived. Each one followed Helen's simple design, 4 inches from the firebox, open at both ends, angled toward the loft. He never claimed the idea was his. Not openly. Everyone in the valley knew where it began. But pride still lived strong in men, and they let him keep his role as builder. Samuel Ducker added a pipe frame to his own cabin after watching his woodpile shrink slower than usual. He did not speak much about it, but his wife did. She told neighbors their children stopped waking in the night. Douglas Peterman returned once more, this time with less certainty in his step. He brought a small draft gauge and checked Helen's flue carefully. No back pressure, he admitted. Draft's clean. Helen nodded. She had known it would be. He studied the steel again. You ever think about patenting this? Quote. She looked at him as if he had spoken a foreign word. I just wanted my boys warm, she said. Peterman did not press further. Some ideas were born from need, not ambition. By early March, steel became the most sought-after material in the valley. Old barn hinges were melted down, broken wagon rims were reshaped, scrap piles vanished, families gathered in sheds to weld together their own versions. Some copied the design exactly. Others experimented, adding extra pipes or extending them higher. Not every attempt worked perfectly, but even flawed versions moved more heat than bare stoves ever had. The difference showed in small ways. Less smoke poured from chimneys. Wood stacks lasted weeks longer. Frost no longer clung thick to loft beams. Children slept without wearing mittens to bed. The valley began to change its tone. Where there had once been laughter at the sight of a widow welding steel, there was now quiet respect. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. One afternoon, Martin Holloway gathered several men outside Helen's cabin. She didn't beat winter, he told them. She outworked it. Inside, Helen was mending boots near the stove. The pipe frame still hummed softly. She no longer noticed the sound. It had become part of the cabin, like the creak of floorboards or the crackle of firewood. Her sons had changed too. Ethan no longer woke, coughing from cold air. Caleb no longer complained about frozen blankets. They climbed down from the loft each morning with clear eyes and steady steps. One evening near the end of March, the temperature dipped again without warning. A late-season cold front rolled down from Canada. Many cabins struggled. Wood piles were already low after months of heavy burning. Helen watched the wind press snow against her windows. She added 2 logs and listened as the pipes carried heat upward. The cabin held steady. Across the valley, other homes with pipe frames did the same. For the first time that winter, fear did not ride with the wind. When April finally arrived, the snow began to soften. Icicles dripped from roof edges. Mud replaced hard ice along the trails. The sky showed pale blue between clouds. Neighbors started visiting not out of need, but gratitude. Samuel Ducker arrived one morning with a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside were thicker steel pipes. Figured you might want to make a stronger version next year, he said quietly, and I was wrong before. Helen accepted the bundle with a small nod. Garrett Finch followed days later. He had orders waiting for next winter already. You mind if I keep building them? He asked. Build them, Helen replied. Just build them right. Garrett agreed. Traders passing through the valley carried stories with them. Word traveled south into Wyoming and west toward Idaho. A Canadian trapper mentioned the design in a letter home. Slowly, the idea moved beyond Montana. But Helen did not ride with it. She stayed where she had always been, chopping wood, setting traps, cooking meals, raising her sons. One quiet afternoon, as snow melted into narrow streams through the valley, she stood beside her stove and rested her hand near the warm pipe. The steel was solid, the welds unbroken, the idea simple. She had not meant to change anything beyond her own walls. Yet the valley now felt warmer because she had refused to accept freezing as fate. And winter, which once ruled without question, had learned that even in northern Montana it could be challenged. By the time the last snow melted from the valley floor, something had shifted that no storm could undo. Cabins that once stood as lonely fights against the cold now carried quiet proof of change. Steel pipe frames wrapped around stoves across northern Montana. Some were rough and crooked, some were clean and straight, but all of them carried the same idea that had begun in a small shed behind Helen Carver's cabin. Capture the heat, move it, do not waste it. Spring came slow that year. Mud swallowed wagon wheels. Streams cut fresh lines through thawing fields. Children ran outside without wrapping scarves around their faces. Horses lifted their heads toward warmer air. Inside her cabin, Helen kept living as she always had. She rose before sunrise. She fed the stove lightly, more out of habit than need. She boiled coffee. She packed bread for her sons before they stepped outside to tend small chores. The pipe frame remained around the stove, blackened slightly from months of steady work. It had not warped. It had not cracked. It had not failed. One by one, neighbors stopped by. Some came with fresh eggs. Some brought cured meat. Some simply stood in her doorway and offered a nod that carried more weight than words. Samuel Ducker returned with a small smile he tried to hide. "My wife says this was the first winter she didn't dread," he told her. Garrett Finch arrived with news that he had built 11 frames already for the next season. Orders were still coming. "Folks from Idaho asked about it," he said. "Heard about it through a trader." Helen listened, stirring a pot of stew. "Build them strong," she replied. Even Douglas Peterman returned one final time before leaving the valley for his spring route. He stepped inside and removed his hat without hesitation. "You were right," he said plainly. Helen did not answer with pride. She only nodded once. In truth, she never set out to prove anyone wrong. She had not wanted attention. She had not wanted credit. She had wanted her sons to sleep without shivering. That was all. But the winter of 1891 had recorded something larger. Families who once burned 15 logs a day now burned 8. Loft temperatures that once hovered near freezing now stayed steady and livable. Woodpiles lasted longer. Fear eased. The valley had learned that survival was not only about endurance. It was about thinking differently. Word of the pipe frame continued traveling. A trapper carried the design north toward Canadian settlements. A merchant mentioned it in Helena. A blacksmith in Wyoming tried his own version and wrote back asking about spacing. Slowly, the idea moved across territories without a patent, without a printed diagram, without a signature. It moved because it worked. Years passed. Ethan and Caleb grew into men. They remembered the winter when frost no longer formed on their blankets. They remembered sparks flying in the shed behind the cabin. They remembered their mother standing firm when others doubted her. By 1897, a journalist rode from Helena after hearing stories of the widow who had changed how cabins held heat. He expected an inventor waiting with blueprints and pride. Instead, he found Helen stirring stew beside the same stove, the same pipes wrapped around it. "Do you consider yourself an innovator?" he asked. Helen looked up from the pot and gave a small laugh. "I just didn't want to freeze," she said. Any mother would have done the same. Quote, "The journalist wrote the words carefully into his notebook. He planned to print them in the paper, but the paper folded before the story ever reached ink. The notes were filed away, forgotten in a dusty archive. Helen never knew. She did not need to. Each winter that followed told the truth better than any newspaper could. Cabins across the valley stayed warmer. Children slept deeper. Wood stacks lasted longer. The cold still came, just as fierce as ever, but it no longer ruled without question. Steel pipes wrapped around wood stoves became as common as iron kettles and cast iron pans. No one argued about where the idea began. They did not need to. They remembered. They remembered the widow who welded steel in a shed while others shook their heads. They remembered the hum of warm air rising for the first time. They remembered the winter that proved numbers do not lie. Helen Carver never called herself brave. She never called herself clever. She simply refused to accept that freezing was the only way. And in the wide, unforgiving land of northern Montana, that quiet refusal changed everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes strength can be quiet, and follow for more stories from the Wild West.